Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Recently, the prominent platform of Premiere Unbelievable featured a compelling discussion between Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro, with the discourse revolving around the question of whether religion serves as a beneficial force for the world. The conversation was brilliant, and I wholeheartedly encourage you to watch it if you haven't already. Towards the end of the exchange, the topic of slavery in the Bible emerged, with Alex emphasising that the explicit endorsement of slavery in the Bible proved to be far from convenient when it came to arguing against slavery. And in response, Ben provided two thought-provoking counter-arguments, and today I aim to address these rebuttals. Now, given that these matters delve into ancient languages and history, I thought I'd try my luck at enlisting the expertise of Dr. Joshua Bowen, a distinguished Assyriologist and author of numerous influential books on the subjects of religion, history, and ethics, to which he graciously agreed. As said, Ben provides two counters. His first is that God might use different logic to us.
As stated right up top, I'm not God. I assume he has different logic than I do.
He states this quickly and then moves on, but we're going to take the time to unpack it. And Ben's second counter is that the Bible is more humanizing than cultures of the same period, with him emphasizing the Code of Hammurabi.
So I like to study the Bible alongside, for example, Hammurabi's Code. And it's really interesting to notice the differences and where the Bible is liberalizing Hammurabi's Code.
What Dr. Josh and I am going to do is respond to these in turn, and so let's get to it.
As far as why didn't the Bible prescribe the perfect world as I would see it, or as you might see it? And the answer is because two reasons. One, as stated right up top, I'm not God. I assume he has different logic than I do.
So there's Ben's first response to the issue of slavery being endorsed in the Holy Book. While it seems contradictory to you and I, and to probably most people, that an all-loving God would sign off on slavery, Ben suggests that God might have a reason perfectly sufficient to himself, and perhaps even his own logic that might even contradict our logic. What do you make of this, Josh?
I mean, this sort of is, the one-stop shop answer in apologetics, right? Isaiah 55, right? God's ways are higher than our ways, right? And so really in any circumstance, I feel like at the end of the day, anybody who is attempting to defend a position in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament or the New Testament or any religious text, really, they can sort of, I guess in a sense, define their way out of it, right? And if you say that God is omniscient and omnipotent and omnibenevolent, even though it might appear, through all of our seemings, to be something immoral or something problematic or something that we could have easily thought of a different and better way to do it. God, we're not God. We don't have those, great making properties. We don't have these omni properties. And so who are we, right? As the clay vessel, who are we to say to the potter, why have you made me thus, right? So, it just seems to me in a sense with a challenge like this, I don't know, that's sort of not really engaging with the problem response. And I understand it. If I were in Ben's position, I'd probably give the same response, right? Because I win no matter what with that response. And so I guess from a strategic standpoint, that works. But I think at the end of the day, this is just skeptical theism, right? It's just we don't know. We can't know, but we know that God knows. And so whatever obtains in this reality, it's going to be ultimately for God's glory, for his good, and so is therefore justifiable because we have defined God as such.
Well, as you said, it's that cry out in Voltaire's Candide, taking the piss, frankly, of Leibniz, saying this must be for the best somehow.
Yeah.
And I think it betrays that for all the arguments and the reason and the logic that someone like Ben will come to the table with, it's all secondary. because he has at his foundation, no, this is a world created by God. And if you push me into an area where I can't give you sufficient reason to, dispense with your objections, I'm just going to appeal to this incredible skepticism and put my hands up and essentially have faith. And as you were pointing out, this move is typically done whenever instances of apparently, I'd say it's obvious, but apparently gratuitous evil comes up. And so you say, look, we're in this situation where in order to get humans alive and flourishing, as if you will say that we're flourishing right now, what we're asked to believe under theism is that God said, right, let's create the earth from 4.5 billion years back, and let's have it so that life slowly emerges through the incredibly brutal process of evolution by natural selection, which isn't judging people by the content of their character. It is annihilating people based on whimsical things that they didn't have any choice in controlling themselves. Then we're asked to buy that there's been mass extinctions where billions of sentient creatures have been wiped out, and we look at this and we go, how do we make sense of this under the rubric of an all-powerful, all-loving God? And the answer that the theists will give, if they go to the skepticism front, is they go, look, I know it does look really bad, but it must be for the best somehow. And that is essentially the answer that Ben's just given here. He said, yeah, it does look pretty bad that an all-loving God signed off on slavery, gave us rules and regulations to follow, but it must have been for the best somehow. And it's Ben wouldn't accept this logic in any other domain of discourse, and so I don't know how he can possibly expect us to accept it in this domain.
I mean, it really is like, to the nth degree, a version of watching the show Monk, if you ever watched that detective show Monk. Because at the beginning of every episode, Adrian Monk points the finger at a particular suspect and says he or she did it. And in almost every case that I can remember, it's always the last person that could have possibly done it, right? But as the viewer, I mean, okay, he did it. Yeah, but Adrian, he was in space at the time of the murder, right? There he is on video. We can see him walking on the moon or something, right? Nope, he did it. As the viewer, you have this insider information. You know that this is what the show is about. You have this track record with Adrian Monk where he always does this and he always points to the right person. And so it doesn't matter to you. In fact, it's almost more exciting to you to have all of your seemings working against you. Mm-hmm. Because that's what makes it fun, right? And I think that this can be very dangerous in these contexts, because I was listening to a discussion a couple of days ago where someone they were talking about Genesis 22 with the Akedah and the binding of Isaac, and the question came up: well, what if God came to you and commanded you to do this thing, to sacrifice your child? And the person, without really a lot of hesitation, said, well, I'd do it. And it's because this mindset is backing into the data. That's what you're doing when you're watching Monk. That's what you're doing from this I think this religious viewpoint. You've already drawn your conclusion, for whatever reason, that God can only do X, right? And so no matter what the data points tell you, you back into them with this already drawn conclusion that God can't command something that would be ultimately immoral.
Absolutely agreed. And what strikes me is the lack of humility, right? So let's take a model, a view that you and I have, and Ben has, and Alex has, and everyone has, basically, and that is that the Earth is a sphere. We're still able to say, you know what? the fact that you go outside and you experience the world as if it's flat, that is data that's in favor of the flat Earth. So fair enough, I admit. However, I'm still convinced of the spherical Earth because of X, Y, and Z. Here is a really clear-cut example where I think the theist needs to hold up their hand and go, yes, this is data that counts against theism. But they can't even give you that. They have to rely on such insane skepticism that they would laugh out of the room if an atheist brought it to the table. And this is the level of skepticism they need to be able to say, look, first things first, it could just be, this has to be for the best somehow. And it's just, I just don't know why people take this seriously. It drives me nuts. But there's Ben's first answer for you.
Mm-hmm. 2, the Bible is in an inherently problematic position in the sense that, on the one hand, it's trying to divulge important truths for all time. At the same time, it's talking to a people of a particular time.
Yes.
And this is a well-worn tradition inside Judaism. So to take the slavery example, there is no mandate to hold slaves in the Bible. Right? There are lots of mandates in the Bible. Many, many mandates. There's 613 of them according to my religion, right? That's why I do all these weird things that I do. But one of those mandates is not to hold slaves.
I found it interesting that even, I'm sure it was not done intentionally, but the way that he worded that last phrase, one of those mandates is not to hold slaves. Out of context, that could be him saying that there was a mandate, quote, do not hold slaves. Of course, I don't think he did that intentionally, but this is interesting to me because, again, I have this new sort of campaign slogan when I talk about this topic, and it's therefore what, right? Okay, so there's not a direct command. Let's just grant that for the sake of argument. There's not a direct command, thou shalt own other people as property. Let's do that. Therefore what? Like there aren't things like, thou shalt go eat a candy bar or something. But the law in the United States certainly allows for that, right? And there's no condemnation of it. There are many laws that just because they are allowed, and many actions that just because they are allowed in the law, we would see that as so. You don't have to go sacrifice your child, right? But you can, right? Like it's not like there were, let's take the Canaanites, for example. It's not that they were required to go sacrifice their children under the biblical narrative. It's that they did, and it was allowed, right? And that's bad. So on the one hand, like it seems like one of these interesting arguments that, again, leads me to just say, therefore what? Follow that up. So, okay, so it's not mandated. Therefore, what? Like, God said it's okay to do it. He just didn't say you had to do it. But the other problem with this is that that's not actually true, right? If you read through passages like Deuteronomy 20, it's not the same as household slavery, right? But the law states that these rules of warfare state that if Israel goes or when Israel goes out to fight, if the city agrees to a vassal treaty, then all of the men, or all the people that become corvée labor to you, right? You can summon them at any point you like and say, come and build this thing for me, just like Solomon did. But if that city puts up a fight, then all the men are killed and all the women, the children, and the livestock become your plunder, right? So these are things these are direct commands. Here's how you do it. So I don't think that just because there's not a law saying thou shalt own another human as property, and if you don't, you're in trouble, right? If you don't go own that other person as property, boy, you're in trouble. There was no command that one had to marry someone, right? But certainly we would say that the law endorsed that practice. So I just don't see this as the big win.
Yeah, well, it's that incredible flex, bro, and it's coming down to, look, your book is very useful for people that like slavery because it's telling you where to get your slaves, how to treat them. It's giving them all of these rules and regulations. It explicitly is endorsing it. And Ben's response is to go, yeah, but look, it doesn't say that you have to have slaves. I'm like, I mean, you know, this all-powerful, all-loving God did see fit to come down to the Israelites and say, look, don't eat pig. I'm going to make that a mandate. But he couldn't come down and say, don't own slaves.
Yeah.
So he can make these radical changes, but not this one. This one's too important. I have to drip feed this to you over 2,000 years so that it comes to fruition during and after the Enlightenment, and then you can take credit for it. It's like, this is such bullshit. It drives me nuts.
And so the idea of there was a society that existed at the time of the Bible in which slaveholding was not only ubiquitous, it was universal, and which was true for virtually all of human history.
That's right.
And could be justified not just in terms of religious scripture, but in terms of Aristotelian thought, right? I mean, the great philosophers we like to cite sometimes in the secular tradition are big fans of slavery. And that's true virtually up until the 18th century.
Yes.
So the idea would be, is this verse attempting to woo people away from a tradition of slavery or to humanize the slaves? Or is it attempting to reinforce that by making it harsher and more difficult? And that's why actually one of the things I enjoy doing in terms of how I study the Bible, for example, is I like to look at contemporaneous religious texts of the time. So I like to study the Bible alongside, for example, Hammurabi's Code. And it's really interesting to notice the differences and where the Bible is liberalizing Hammurabi's Code.
Yeah. So, okay, let me be charitable here. I'm going to assume that what Ben is thinking of in his mind are passages like Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus 25. In Deuteronomy 15, the text says that in Exodus 21, you know, an earlier thing called the Covenant Code, the law said that an Israelite was allowed to keep another Israelite, but only for 6 years, and they had to release them in the seventh, and their debt was paid for. In Deuteronomy 15, it appears that this gets developed to the point that he can keep him for 6 years, but then he has to release him in the seventh, and when he does, he has to provide him with sort of like a homewarming gift or something, like, all right, you're going back, you don't have any money with you, so I'm going to give you some food, I'm going to give you some provisions so that you can get started because you don't have anything to take with you because you've been my debt slave for these 6 years. And was that, more humanitarian? Sure. I don't think it was ever practiced because it was contingent upon the supernatural intervention of the deity, but I'm going to assume he's thinking about that, and I'm going to assume he's thinking about Leviticus 25, where the text actually does say, you are no longer allowed to keep fellow Israelites as slaves, right? If they sell themselves to you, you're not allowed to treat them as a slave. You have to treat them as a hired worker. So those are the two passages that I'm going to assume he's thinking of, right, when it's talking about humanizing the slave or bring things up. And there are a couple things that I want to point out about this. So the first point is in Leviticus 25, when it talks about, no longer being allowed, Israelites no longer being allowed to keep other Israelites as slaves, this was through supernatural provision. The whole chapter is predicated on supernatural provision. Yahweh is going to come down and provide for them. And the same was true, as I said, in Deuteronomy 15. So I think these are utopian-like, right, idealistic laws that probably were never put in play. But in best case scenario, let's just grant it, these are the two passages, it's only for Israelites. Mm-hmm. The text is explicitly clear that even though you are to do these things for your fellow Israelites, when it comes to foreigners, full chattel slaves, that's where you get them. So actually, if these passages are the ones that he's referring to, and he may not be, right? He may just be saying generally speaking and not thinking of anything in particular. But these are the passages that you would turn to to make an appeal for a humanitarian development in the Hebrew Bible when it comes to slavery, and yet they're not the flex that people think that they are. In fact, I think it's quite condemning for this argument because it says they recognize the bad position that a slave is in. It's not a position that the person wants to be in or should be in, right? And yet, with that recognition, the text still goes on to say at the command of the deity, if you want slaves, full chattel slaves, here's where you get them. They'll be your property. You'll keep them for life, right? You pass them on as inheritance. You can make them serve forever, right? But you cannot, the text says, do this to your fellow Israelites. So I think this is very problematic, one. Number two, when it comes to making comparisons to things like the law collections of the ancient Near East, and here Ben cites the most famous one, the law collection of Hammurabi, I would be surprised. I would be surprised if Ben has seriously studied the laws about slavery in the laws of Hammurabi. I could be wrong. But there are some pretty telltale things that stand out in the law collections of Hammurabi that aren't really good for this type of comparison. So, for example, the law stipulates that if a person is taken as a debt slave, in the Hebrew Bible, it says they serve for 6 years and are released in the 7th. Laws of Hammurabi, only 3 years. Right, so how would he square that? Laws of Hammurabi say you only have to serve for 3 years and you're released in the 4th. Seems like the Hebrew Bible is going backwards. Right? It seems like, here in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, this is going backwards. And as a matter of fact, and I'll land with this, but Bruce Wells, who's a very well-known ancient Near Eastern law specialist and works in the Hebrew Bible, obviously, as well, has written about Leviticus 25 and makes the argument this is a type of anticritic loan that is actually under the guise of being good for the Israelite slave. It actually turns out to be bad for him, worse for him. And so it's an interesting it's an interesting article. But the point, even if we say set that aside, we think it is a positive thing for the slave. It's not. Going to the law collections of Hammurabi, I don't think is where you want to go. In fact, one of the things that I write about I said I was going to land with the last one here. I'll land with this one. Sorry. In my book, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? I point out that in Laws of Hammurabi, number 87, which is sort of in this broken section, it's not completely clear, but scholars have, I think, justifiably interpreted this law to mean that if a slave runs away and there is some type of maltreatment by the slave owner for which he ran away, or it was because of that mistreatment that he ran away, he is not to be returned to that master. So if it was determined, it seems, that in the laws of Hammurabi, if it was determined that the slave was or the slave master was abusing his slave, the law made provision for that slave not to be returned to him. So, these are things that, and people will want to cite Deuteronomy 23, 15, and 16, right? Don't return a slave to his master. That's not talking about just any slave. It's talking about foreign slaves that are escaping from foreign lands into Israel. This is about having extradition treaties with these vassal states. So, again, and we've talked about that elsewhere, so I won't rehash it, here. But, this is just these types of comparisons. I have an entire chapter about these types of comparisons in that most recent book on slavery, and you just don't see the Hebrew Bible making these big strides forward that it seems like Ben is either stating directly or implying.
I'll add two things to that. The first is actually a comment we received on the last collaboration that we did. You shouldn't apologize for speaking, good sir. We want to hear what you have to say. So please, not on Rationality rules. You're not allowed to apologize anymore. It's the first rule I've given to someone. It might be the only. The second thing to be said is that this really is devastating for Ben's position because with God coming down and saying to the Israelites, you know what, I'm ruling out slavery, the bad type of slavery, completely for my people. So he's doing it for only the Israelites. It has this overwhelming recognition of it being wrong, and more importantly to the argument here, that God can make these big definitive changes. He can come down and go, you know that pork you're eating? You're not doing it anymore. You know that slavery that you're doing to your own people? You're not doing it anymore. But he doesn't do it for foreign slaves. And what we need is an explanation, and it just isn't good enough to say, it's for a reason perfectly sufficient to God.
Let me just add one last thing to that to sort of tie that in a nice little bow. The main argument out, if somebody has to dive down into this, right, as an apologist, and say, okay, yeah, obviously God's not going to command something immoral. He had to allow this because of the hardness of man's heart or whatever. The thing that they normally wind up on is, look, as Ben was probably implying this, I suspect, could be wrong, but I suspect, that every culture did it, right? And it was part of the economic system. And God can't just come down, Yahweh can't just come down and say, all right, I'm going to do away with this thing that your economy is dependent upon. Well, lo and behold, that's exactly what he does in Leviticus 25. The problem is that Yahweh can say and does say, don't worry about your pocketbook. Don't worry about not sowing and reaping in the seventh year, right? Every 7 years. Don't worry about that. I will supernaturally take care of that. Mm-hmm. I will make the land, produce so much that you'll actually get 2, full years worth of stuff if you listen to me, if you obey me. And don't worry about not taking a slave from your fellow Israelites. Don't worry about every 50th year sending everybody back with their debts completely wiped free or wiped clean. Don't worry about that. I will supernaturally provide for you. So God explicitly comes in and says, don't worry about the economic side of this. I got you, right? So that argument simply doesn't hold inside of the narrative itself. It doesn't hold. So then you have to say, why is it that God can say, I recognize here, ostensibly in the text, I'm making it clear that it's a disadvantageous position for someone to be a slave, right? And I don't want you doing this to fellow Israelites, not because I think that there's some sort of moral aspect tied to it in the passage, but it's not an advantageous thing, like being charged interest on a loan, right? I think it falls roughly under the same category in the mind of the writer, but he can do it, and he can say no more for fellow Israelites, and that will require supernatural intervention. But don't worry, Yahweh will do it. But he can't then extend that out to foreign slaves.
God works in mysterious ways.
Indeed.
Yes, example.
Absolutely.
And so the idea that a divine revelation has to be given to human beings who are capable of following that in the time. Again, that's part of the difficulty of I think rebutting religion in a certain sense, because again, it seems wiggly, but it really isn't, in the sense that if you believe, as I do, in a God who spoke to human beings in some form or fashion and has to speak to them on a level that they can understand, in ways they can understand, then that immediately is going to discount the ability to do a lot of very radical things that would have appeared radical in 1200 BC, but now appear to be commonplace for us.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there are underlying assumptions in the text, right? That 1200, is when the statement there is, I think, trying to link the law of Moses to the late Bronze Age, or early Iron One. But obviously, like I don't think we need to focus in on that. But again, the one thing that I would say that is the Achilles heel of Ben's position here, and the position that many apologists now take, right, this sort of progressive revelation idea, is that even when you come, and I know Ben wouldn't want to do this, I wouldn't think, but even when you come to the New Testament, where is the progression? Right? Ben said it himself, right? It's not until the 18th century that you start to see this. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, Ben, it's not that he's giving, he's having to do a big data dump, even though we've just talked about how he did do a data dump, right? According to the narrative in Leviticus 25 about this topic. But even if you assume that that's not the case, right? Even if you somehow interpret that differently, it's not that he's giving little by little by little by little. It's not like when you read through the New Testament or the early church, or, like you're starting to see these incremental moves forward or something. You don't, right? It takes quite a while in early Christianity for this stuff to be picked up on in any real meaningful sense. And certainly not, certainly not in the gospel, certainly not in the life of Jesus, as we try to reconstruct it. This progressive revelation, I think, is incredibly problematic. And it really just is, it can answer any question in one sense, right? Because had slavery just been outlawed today, we could be like, progressive revelation just took this long. Like, why, right?
Yeah, this progressive revelation, there's another side to it, and that is that theists don't seem to recognize it for what it is, and it's moral relativism. If you're saying that God comes in and he hasn't made it so that slavery's wrong back in a certain time with a certain economic situation or a certain context, then what you're saying is that there were deterministic factors outside of what's right and wrong that fed into God's decision and the way that he's going to have his revelation unfold. And so he is saying that in certain circumstances, it's perfectly kosher to have slaves. It's perfectly kosher to treat women as second-class citizens. It's perfectly kosher to treat homosexuals and the LGBT community in general as if they're abominations. Just as time comes along, that changes. Well, that's moral relativism. Like, you don't get to, say, I don't like atheism because it's got some form of moral relativism, which is a hell of a claim in its own right, because you've got different moral views among atheists. But you don't get to come up with this rhetoric, and yet whenever you're pushed into a defense of the problematic parts of your morality, you fall into moral relativism yourself. It's just not good enough. If this is the relativity, if God can completely flip it so that objective morality means having slaves, and then objective morality means not having slaves. Objective morality means having women being second-class citizens, and then objective morality means them being equal. You're playing tennis without the net. Like, you wouldn't accept this kind of nonsense elsewhere. So why are you doing it for your religion? Well, I think we know the answer. In wrapping up, I just want to again encourage everyone who hasn't seen the conversation between Alex and Ben to check it out at Premiere Unbelievable. It's linked below. I also want to sincerely thank Dr. Josh for his time and brilliance. If you're interested in knowing more about slavery and the Bible, then be sure to check out his wonderful work, which is also linked below. Lastly, I want to thank supporters of Rationality Rules. Without you, we can't make videos such as this. So thank you kindly. It makes a world of difference.